In 1826, shortly after the death of his father, and witnessing the spiral downward of his son George, John Quincy Adams wrote in his diary,
"My health has been languishing without sickness, a sluggish carelessness of life, and an imaginary wish that it were terminated."
Mr. Adams was suffering from a relapse of depression, something that had plagued him for a number of years. This depression could only be spiraled further downwards by the stress of the upcoming 1828 election, the election that would eventually see his loss of presidency to Andrew Jackson. But that would not be the only stress to ever occur in Mr. Adams' life. He was the son of one of the founding fathers, John Adams, and spent his lifetime trying to live up to his father's achievements. This stress wore on Mr. Adams' body. At 21, after delivering a speech at Harvard University, John Adams fell into a deeper depression than ever before. Now in the 21st century, we can examine the basis behind Mr. Adams' melancholy. Mr. Adams was more than likely experiencing a dysfunction of the Hpa Axis, promoting and reoccurring bouts of depression. This dysfunction more than likely arose due to a phenomenon called allostatic overload, the wear and tear on the body due to chronic stress. Therefore, to understand Mr. Adams' depression, we must explore the Hpa axis. It's a pathway that begins in the brain, but ends up affecting the entire body. Deep inside the primal part of the brain is the hypothalamus. It's our first stop in understanding President Adams' terrible melancholy. Its primary function is a link between the brain's neurons and the endocrine/hormone system. It's the way your brain is translated into various physiological processes around the body. Think of it like a central controller of a factory. It plays a role in almost all of the behavioral functions of the brain. When stressed, perhaps like John Quincy Adams was in 1790, as his mother wrote to him to tell him that he cannot marry his current love, Mary Fraser, stating,
"Never form connections until you see a prospect of supporting a family. Never take a woman from an eligible situation and place her below it."
John Quincy Adams was forced to terminate his relationship. This kind of stress could have triggered the activation of the hypothalamus. In a panic, the hypothalamus releases corticotropin-releasing hormone into a capillary. CRH moves down the capillary into the pituitary gland. This powerful little hormone has a variety of functions, including being important in the gut. Our next stop on the tour of John Quincy Adams' brain is the pituitary gland. CRH travels to the anterior pituitary gland after release from the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland is a pea-sized endocrine gland that helps control everything from metabolism to reproduction. In this case, upon contact with CRH, the pituitary gland releases adrenocorticotropic hormone. The arbitrarily long-named ACTH flows in the blood to the final stop of our journey. ACTH lands on the adrenal cortex, located above the kidneys. This stimulates the release of cortisol, among other hormones. Cortisol is a key to the whole pathway. It's the primary stress response in humans. Traditionally, it activates anti-stress and anti-inflammatory pathways. It also provides a feedback mechanism. It signals up to the brain to stop the stress response, inhibiting both the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, preventing an overload of cortisol. Normally, the stress response is beneficial to the body. It would prepare John Quincy Adams for the threat the body had sensed. However, constant activation of the Hpa axis, i.e., being constantly stressed, will have an overloading effect on the body. The feedback mechanisms will dysfunction, becoming unable to stop the stress process, leading to constant activation of the Hpa axis and a flooding of cortisol in the body. During the short term, the stress response from cortisol is beneficial. However, long-term effects of the anti-stress/anti-inflammatory response are especially harmful. It's thought that these long-term effects are playing a role in the neurotransmission theory of depression, specifically relating to norepinephrine and serotonin, and elevated cortisol levels are found within depressed patients. Possibly dysfunction is related to impaired glucocorticoid receptors, a kind of lock that allows cortisol, the key, to enact its effects on the cell. It's possible that this constant activation damages the growth of new neurons and the survival of current neurons, particularly in the hippocampus, an area of the brain critical in learning, memory, and emotion. It's thought that early life stress can predispose or be a causative factor in depression and dysfunction of the Hpa axis. It is here that we understand John Quincy Adams' reoccurring episodes. His early life stressors predisposed his mind to the melancholy that he could just not shake. Historian Paul C. Najal initially proposed this theory in his book John Quincy Adams, A Public and Private Life. Adams led a stressful childhood. His mother Abigail was harsh and unaccepting of his illnesses. His father spent most of his childhood fighting the Revolutionary War. Not only that, but he had to live up to his father's namesake. So it comes as no surprise that John suffered from depression throughout his adolescence. He was constantly journaling his stress. Therefore, we can conclude John Quincy Adams had predisposed himself to a dysfunction of the Hpa axis, leading to his later life episodes of depression. But the moral of the story here is not that one is predisposed to mental illness, and nothing can be done to stop the march of time. No, you should take away that mental illness are real, observable diseases with complex biological underlyings. Advances in understanding and treatments are coming in at an alarming rate. John Quincy Adams may have suffered, but like all endings, there was hope. He spent his post-presidency time as an advocate of science and an abolitionist. John Quincy Adams didn't let his mental illness or his early life stress define him, and it's a lesson we all can take. Mental illness does not always have to be a defining character trait. And to quote John Quincy Adams,
Courage and perseverance have a magical talisman, before which difficulties disappear and obstacles vanish into the air.